Hello, everyone. This is Bill Griffin. Welcome to the Different Take podcast. And today I would like to talk about the idea that inflation has anything to do with greed. Now, what I mean by this is I recently read or saw an article that I want to talk to you about by a gentleman named Robert Reich. Now, if you don't know who Robert Reich is, he was the former Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton. He was Secretary of Labor. He has been a constant figure on television as a talking head doing political commentary for a lot of different networks. I would consider him to be a leftist. Yes, he did serve during the entire first term under Bill Clinton for 4 years. So he's an academic. Political stances are almost always left-wing. And he recently wrote this article that appeared in Salon, on Salon.com. Now, Salon.com, if you don't know, is it caters to the liberal point of view and the liberal mindset. So this article starts off with this headline: "What's really driving inflation?" And the answer: corporate greed. What's really driving inflation? Corporate greed. This was published December 1st this year, 2021. And like, I've always found him to be a bit of a, in his appearances I've seen, to be pretty sincere in his beliefs at the moment. Contradictory, and this article is no different. So his assertion in this article is that the biggest, I'll just read a little bit, the biggest culprit for rising prices that's not being talked about is the increasing economic concentration of the American economy in the hands of a relatively few giant big corporations with the power to raise prices. This sort of, there's a lot of problems with this assertion. It just don't make a lot of sense to me. Inflation is caused by a larger money supply, and when inflation being defined as higher prices. Expanded or inflation of money supply means more dollars or fewer, the same goods and services chasing more dollars. And inflation is very, and I think Mr. Reich would agree with this, inflation, of course he doesn't really talk about it in this article, but this is, this hurts the folks on fixed income, people on government assistance, low income, and it really hurts people that are trying to save, or it hurts people that it hurts savers because they're not earning a return on the cash that they have, and people that are risk averse don't want to, or maybe are older and don't have a long time horizon, will have their savings in a vehicle that doesn't earn a rate that comes close to the inflation rate, or rate of inflation. So the inflation that we have in 2021 is really hurts the people that primarily Democrats purport to, or they say they purport to help, and it's actually, they're the ones that are going to be hurt the most. So Robert Reich and says that this is about the economy being in the hand of the relatively few giant big corporations. Well, there are some big corporations, whether they're driving the entire economy That's just not really very accurate. Or I should say, are they any bigger than they have been historically? So the idea that companies can, okay, now have the power to raise pricing would mean that they imply that they only have this power now. In other words, they didn't have the power to raise pricing at any other time, and that they're being greedy now. So the idea that the corporations are greedy now but weren't greedy at other times doesn't really make a lot of sense. So prices fluctuate, and the companies he's referring to, the pricing has fluctuated, and the companies that he mentioned do have competitors. So the corporations that he lists are Procter and Gamble and Kimberly-Clark. They were going to charge more for everything from diapers to toilet paper, citing rising costs for raw material. And he says, no, that's not what their motivation is. But he does not talk about whether they're fair or not. So the idea that these two companies, which have had a great deal of the market share, they do have competitors, but they have the two companies together have a great deal of market share. And the idea that they've never had this ability to raise pricing, and that will equal higher profits. And it's done out of the motive of greed. It's just kind of silly. Pricing is higher across the board, across every industry. You can't have the consumer price index jumping 6.8% from 1 year ago, and this is happening across the board. There's virtually no industry that almost all industries have higher pricing. You can't have 6.8% inflation rate without this thing across the board. So the idea that, well, if these handful of greedy corporations, as Mr. Reich says, are the culprit for the 6.8% rate, are all the other companies that are raising prices at the same levels, are they also just as greedy? It says, quote, if markets were competitive, companies would seek to keep their prices down in order to maintain customer loyalty and demand. When the prices of their supplies rose, they cut their profits before they raised prices to their customers for fear that otherwise a competitor would grab those customers away. Well, he's implying that he'd like to see freer markets. And even at the very end of this article, which he implies that markets, he really doesn't. That's not. He's never been one for free markets. He believes in government intervention. The solution to these problems is to aggressively use the government to use aggressive use of antitrust law. Well, that doesn't mean he's not going to talk about getting rid of government subsidies, or he doesn't talk about removing barriers to entry that smaller competitors certainly face. And he's talking about these companies as if they're as if they don't have any competitors. Another big problem is he's referring to, when he talks about profits, he's referring to future profits. He's not no one can predict future profits. If you could produce future profits, you'd be sort of having extrasensory powers of some sort, that you can predict the future and you can predict the weather and that sort of thing. No one is able to any sort of degree of success. Another reason that these companies have been quite successful or have had great earnings, the fact that many smaller competitors are affected by the last couple of years with the restrictions that they've had to deal with. Larger companies are going to have an easier time with those things. It also says the underlying structural problem, quote, same Salon.com article, quote, the underlying structural problem isn't that government is overstimulating the economy. It's that big corporations are under-competitive. So this idea that the government spending, which increases the debt, does not pressure the Federal Reserve to expand the money supply is off the charts. There's no other way to say it, dumb. This is just an insanely dumb thing that Robert Reich is saying. And he said a lot of other dumb things in his career, but this is really, he's 75 years old. He's not gonna get much better. He goes on, quote, corporations are using the excuse of inflation to raise prices and make fatter profits. The result is a transfer of wealth from consumers to corporate executives and major investors. There's no question that these companies have tremendous, the companies you're referring to, not Kimberly Clark, but he also talks about PepsiCo. He's talking about the banks, Monsanto, the pharmaceuticals. He goes through all these companies have had tremendous market power for many years. Pricing has fluctuated, and their earnings have fluctuated. So this idea that they're using the excuse of inflation to raise prices and make fatter profits is, again, ridiculous, because he has no way to know whether earnings, these higher pricing that he's referring to consumers, will mean higher earnings. He cannot know that. He can make these predictions because no one's going to come back to him and say, hey, Robert Reich, you're wrong, if he is wrong. So this idea that these companies just all of a sudden became greedy is, it's ridiculous. Now, again, not to ramble too much, but there's no question that these companies would, if they were broken up, as he says, may be better for consumers. Best thing for the consumers is to have companies that are competitive, and the best way to have competitive in a free market is to remove barriers to entry, government regulations, stifle, and also rewarding donors with regulations that favor these companies and with subsidies that favor these companies. So that would be a sensible approach, which Robert Reich would not take, would never encourage that sort of thing. He is a leftist and believes in the power of government. I will give him a little credit for at least acknowledging the fact that more competition would be great for consumers, but the idea that inflation is caused by companies raising prices just completely ignores the fact that when their pricing was lower, that happened, then of course it's happened. They're being moral because they really care about the consumer more than their shareholder. So he would never ever assert that. There's a great clip of Milton Friedman discussing free market capitalism with a fellow named Phil Donahue. He's a TV host at a daytime TV show. I think his audience is, because of the time of day, was primarily women. And that's neither here nor there, but he has Milton Friedman on his show. And to Phil Donahue's credit, he would have guests on that were interesting guests that he would have never agreed with politically, but he would have them on, and then later on in his career he got off the rails with very sensational type guests and that sort of thing that weren't my opinion. But at any rate, this is a great clip, and it will explain far better than I can how we have self-interest, and he discusses greed and that the concept that, well, politicians are greedy too. So if you haven't seen this before, I hope you enjoy it.
See around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries. When you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system.
But it seems to reward not virtue as much as ability to manipulate the system.
And what does reward virtue? You think the communist commissar rewards virtue? You think a Hitler rewards virtue? You think, excuse me, if you'll pardon me, do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of the virtue of the people appointed or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us. Well, I don't even trust you to do that.
Greed, you describe how people that don't agree with you can say that you're immoral. I think it's an overused word. It's used often. that don't truly know the motivations, without going into where there are good uses. I'll just say that this isn't a good use, because if your definition is to say that someone's immoral or not doing the right thing, because there's no way Mr. Reich could know that. His explanation just doesn't add up. He has no way to know, just to summarize, he has no way to know whether corporations, well, these companies he refers to, that raise prices to will make more money, because this is in the future. He can't know that. Looking at the last quarter, you have to think long term for the shareholders. That's the further. There's the idea that inflation is caused by anything other than expanding the money supply is ludicrous. That is the reason. There is no other reason. Our government, our federal government, has spent this. They're not taking in enough revenue to cover their spending, and the Federal Reserve, as a result, has expanded the money supply, and the Fed, as of even today, is looking to, there are members of the Federal Reserve that are talking about raising rates in 2022 to combat rising prices or inflation. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. That basically the idea of inflation is attributed to other factors when there is really only one thing that's causing it. And it's a insidious tax on that are in the low, that are on fixed income or at the lowest, or in the lowest income brackets, especially those that are trying to save or have savings. They're being eroded every month that goes by. So I hope you've enjoyed what I've had to say, and I really appreciate you listening. And I hope you check out our website and see what platforms we're on. If you have any comments, I'd love to hear what they are. And thank you very much.